Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Faulkner. Well, we have reached week 3 of our 10 for 10 leads to 20. For those of you just tuning in, this is a 10-week experiment where we are asking each person to tithe 10% for 10 weeks. Each week we have 2 mandates. The first is to continue to seek to tithe at the 10%, and if you are already doing so, then we ask you to increase your tithe by 10%. So for example, if you're tithing $10 a week, we're asking you to increase your tithe by 10%. So in this case, $1 to make it $11 a week. And we ask you to do this over a 10-week period. Now the second mandate is related to the corporal works of mercy. And this week's comes from the Gospel of Luke. Give sight to the blind. So we are asking that you bring in your used or old glasses to provide to the Lions Club. The Lions Club is an organization that works to help those who are blind or visually impaired. Now, before I begin, I want to share with you how God works. Earlier this week, before Bishop Kevin left for Tanzania, I happened to be in the office when he came by to drop some things off before his trip. So we were catching up and discussing things that would need to be done while he was away. He asked if I would prepare this week's video for the 10 for 10. Quite truthfully, I hesitated at first. So he shared with me the biblical mandate, give sight to the blind, and we talked a little more, but I eventually agreed. Many of you know I'm working towards a master's degree in theology, and my hesitation was due to trying to catch up on some classwork. This semester, we are studying Ignatius of Loyola. Now, St. Ignatius is the founder of the Jesuits, but he also developed spiritual exercises, which offer a guide in the examination of conscience. And so to do this, one of the books we are using is called Moment by Moment, A Retreat in Everyday Life, whereby each week we take one moment to pray on throughout the week. So I was actually behind a week, and I still am, but that's another point. So later that day, I went to read through the moment that I was behind on. Now, there are several parts to this. There's usually scripture to contemplate, questions for us to consider, and so on. So one of the scripture readings from this particular moment was from Luke 18:35 to 43, which is about the blind beggar from Jericho. I was thinking this can't be a coincidence. I then went on to the questions, and the first question was, what am I beginning to realize about my own blindness? Now keep in mind, blindness comes in different forms. Now granted, I didn't know that this was the particular questions or scripture when Father Kevin and I were speaking earlier. I don't believe in coincidences, so I know God is at work here. So as I reflected on the biblical mandate to tithe the 10%, my train of thought initially went something like this. Well, a mandate seems like an obligation, and sometimes obligations feel like burdens. Well, that seems pretty negative, and I'm pretty sure that's not what God intended when He instructed us in the tithing. So let's look at the definitions of both mandate and obligation. Now, mandate is an official order or commission to do something. Okay, that makes sense. Then I looked up the meaning of obligation. Now, there are several ways that obligation is defined, but this particular definition stood out. An obligation is a debt of gratitude. Wow, I had never thought of an obligation in that way. But when I looked at it from that perspective, a debt of gratitude, we can't ignore that we owe a debt of gratitude to God. After all, He gave the ultimate sacrifice. Even at a more practical level, our gifts and our charisms come from God. These gifts and skills are in part what provides us with our financial resources or the ability to obtain those financial resources. So if you think about it, these resources, and all of them, really belong to God. But guess what? He only asks us to return 10% of these resources. And yet, many still hesitate because sometimes when we consider 10% of our resources, that can seem like a lot. But look at it from another perspective. There's still 90% left to sustain us. Have you ever stopped to consider that? I mean, he's given a mandate that we give 10% back, but not the other 90%. Really, what a generous God that we have. So, what's the problem? Well, going back to Ignatius in the moment, I realized that there really are many forms of blindness. And as I thought about it, I realized that in the past, at least for myself, I focused on relinquishing the 10%. I didn't really consider the other 90%. And truthfully, I was probably blinded by a fear that didn't really exist, although at the moment it seemed pretty real. I was also blind to looking at other ways of thinking about the tithe. I wasn't looking at it as proportional giving. And over the course of my life, there have been times that I have struggled financially, but time and time again, God always provided, and often in ways that were unexpected. I realized that I should be more like the blind beggar. He believed with all his heart and soul that Jesus would restore his sight, and he did. As my class note said, he had an expectant faith. Do we have an expectant faith that God will provide for us when it comes to our financial resources? Are we blind to what proportional giving is truly about? I'll leave you with those questions and with the following 4 things. Consider the biblical mandate to tithe as a debt of gratitude. Consider areas where you may be blind and ask God to restore your sight to them. And have an expectant faith that God will provide. And lastly, give sight to the blind by donating your old glasses so that the sight of others can be restored. God bless everybody. Have a great week.